I listen to these podcasts and it sounds like everyone runs experiments and they get these massive wins. They just quadrupled the size of their revenue and everyone talks about the checkbox winning and this thing winning or that winning. But what nobody gets up on stage and talks about is that 80% of experiments that people run do not move the needle.
We know how hard it is to find and afford the A players who will help your startup succeed. But don't despair. Instead, talk to our friend of the pod, Until Now. Until Now gives you access to top-tier fractional experts, so you don't have to settle. I've worked with these folks at Airtasker, and they're behind the rebrand of this very podcast. They are the real deal. Check out their work and get in touch at untilnow.com.au. Growth is oxygen for startups. Sooner or later, you'll want to do Google Ads, Instagram, display, TikTok, SEO, what have you. Newsflash, you will not do these well on your own. That's where Insil comes in. There are a lot of agencies out there, but not many of them are rated 4.8 stars on Google. Do growth right. Go to insil.com.au to get in touch and tell them we sent you.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast, a show focused on helping you build, run, and invest in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're an investor, founder, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights on the principles that power high-growth disruption the way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Yaniv.
And I'm Chris.
And I'm Andres.
And in today's episode, we're going to talk about experimentation and split testing. This is one of the most frustratingly misunderstood areas of all of product, and we're delighted to have an absolute expert joining us here on the show to demystify the topic. Andres Glusman spent nearly 15 years at Meetup and played a pivotal role in the company's growth all the way through to its acquisition by WeWork in 2017 for a reported $156 million. Andres learned a huge amount about growth and experimentation during his time at Meetup and has leveraged all his knowledge in his role as CEO at DoWhatWorks, a company that allows you to learn from the experiments run by other companies. Andres, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Wonderful introduction.
So I thought we could start by just telling us a little bit about your history, especially growing Meetup.
Yeah, so I played almost every single role you can play over the course of a decade and a half of Meetup. I made their first $14 of revenue and then took on a variety of different roles, including product and growth and community and strategy. And we were kind of this accidental lean startup. We discovered experimentation early on in our tenure because we went from pure guessing and hoping something would work to starting to run experiments. And thankfully, the first few that we ran actually worked and they made a difference. And that gave us a lot of motivation to actually double down and keep running some more. But over the course of time, we really got to experience all the joys of experimentation and all the pains of experimentation too. We basically doubled and tripled the size of our team and were able to drive phenomenal growth. But it also came with sort of some double-edged components and some downsides that I learned a lot of lessons from that I'd be happy to dive into with you all today.
Absolutely. And of course, Meetup is such an incredible service. I think most people listening have probably used it at some point in their lives and careers. So it's really brilliant to see the impact that this product has had.
It's pretty wonderful to be at a conference and to have people find out that you worked at Meetup and they say, oh my God, it changed my life. I lost the weight. I started the company. I met my partner. I learned to sing. I learned whatever. It's one of those game-changing companies for people. So it's a real pleasure to be a part of it.
So Andres, I think when you talk about experiments, people probably imagine people in lab coats mixing chemicals and hadron colliders. In the context of tech startups, Silicon Valley style startups, let's maybe just define what exactly is an experiment. What does it look like?
Yeah. So in the context of a website in particular, or email or any kind of experiment really involves systematically varying the experience across random segments of an audience at the same time to be able to understand how the presence of A, B, or C affects people's ultimate behavior. So in the simplest of terms, does a button that says click here work better than a button that says click now, as an example? Methodologically, it borrows from the world of science in that you have a control group and you have an affected group, and half the people, for example, will see click here, half the people will see click now. You'll run it for some period of time until you reach statistical significance. And then after that, you'll basically see that one of those two variants had a better outcome and ultimately go down and double down on that outcome. The reason why you might do that is because if you don't run things as experiments, you're not able to really get any kind of causality. And you're not able to really learn what, if anything, that you do makes a difference. And so in the early years of Meetup, when we were running a lot of different things, we had a really good product sense. We were able to do a lot well. But when it came to optimizing and driving growth and trying to change people's behaviors, which, let's face it, Meetup was the ultimate behavior change. Going from an anonymous internet to actually meeting strangers on the internet, you can't get more behavioral change than that. And when we tried to change parts of the website to motivate behaviors to get more people to meet up, more often than not, we would just guess. And those guesses not only wouldn't make a difference, but we'd spend months trying to figure out what happened, and we wouldn't actually learn. So we wouldn't even get better every time we launched something that didn't work. And so when you run things as experiments, the upside is that you get lift and it works. When it doesn't work, you get learning. And that's why people like me who love science and who are very curious and who want to gravitate towards things that work, the more you can figure out which of your ideas are actually backed by fact, right? Which in fact are the things that approximate the truth of what does move a behavior. The more you can do those things, and the more likely it is that you can design an experience that produces the outcomes you want. It gets more people to buy, gets more people to lose the weight, gets more people to sign up. Whatever it is that you're optimizing for, by running your changes as an experiment, you can learn. And by learning, you get closer and closer to the truth.
You said for those who are curious and like science, I'd say also those who like success, right? Those who want to see a material impact on the world.
It's very true. I mean, our growth at Meetup went from nice linear growth, which is great. You're lucky to get that, to this kind of hockey sticking effect when we started running experiments, because we were able to figure out those things that worked. And when you double down on those things that work, you're really going to compound interest effect. And so you really do start to accelerate in a pretty dramatic way.
I wanted to dive in a bit. You talked about causality, and I think that's so important. As a founder, after a while, you start to feel that viscerally. If you don't have controlled experiments in the way that you talk about, there are so many different things that are happening all the time, so many variables, so many possible causes. If all you see is, number go up or number go down, you don't really know what's causing it. That means it's very hard to develop your product sense, and it's very hard to continue to iterate and improve the product experience. You just have this undifferentiated massive product, and your numbers are doing a certain thing, and you're not sure which is causing what. I read a blog post, I think it was from one of the early growth people at Etsy, who talked about the fact that they were basically shipping product feature after product feature, and their usage numbers kept going up and up, and they were giving each other high fives and patting each other on the back. But then at a certain point, they started doing ablation experiments when they started actually removing features to see what happened. And they realized that none of the features that they were so proud of were actually contributing to the metrics that they cared about, right? There was simply a correlation. They were shipping features on a product that already had product market fit, and they were taking the credit for it, but those features were not driving that. So it is so important to avoid wasting your time. And like you said, to make sure that we're actually learning, and then we can apply that learning in future to have some control in your experiments.
That's exactly right. And in the most extreme case, let's say you run a weight loss company and you're heading into the new year. Any change you make, you're going to see a growth. You're going to see more people signing up for weight loss products at the very start of the year because of New Year's resolutions. If you attribute that outside phenomena to the change you made, you're just taking credit for some outside factor. You might as well be taking credit for the weather because you have no ability to affect it, but you're getting the benefit from it. And so when you run it as an experiment, you can actually start to tease things apart and understand, well, what part of what I did actually made a difference? And to your point, sometimes removing things is actually one of the best experiments you can run, or one of the best optimizations you can run comes from reduction as opposed to from addition.
Yeah, it's so funny when you say you're doing weight loss into the new year. When the numbers are going up, you say it's because of the features that you were shipping. When the numbers go down, well, that's seasonality, right? Like when everyone comes off the New Year's resolution,
so
numbers are going, they're like,
it's so
people
true.
start scratching their heads and they're like, oh, what's causing this? They're like, oh, it must be seasonality. And what you get is this type of cargo culting, right? Where it's like, all we know is the numbers are moving up and down, and we're trying to explain these things after the fact, but we don't have the causal link. And there are so many variables that you can fit just about any narrative that you want to those numbers. That's such a dangerous place to be, because sooner or later, your natural growth will run out, and then you are left not knowing which bits of your product are good and which bits of your product are not.
You're 100% right. It's funny, when I had new people join the company at Meetup, I wanted to really impart that idea that you can ascribe any story you want to any set of numbers. And more often than not, your assumptions, your beliefs going in are going to basically be wrong. The way that I really explained that to people was I would have a lunch and learn with every new hire once a month. And we'd go around the table and I'd show them 5 experiments from Meetup's past. And then I'd make every single person guess what was the outcome. Which one do you think won? And of course, they were designed in a way that is impossible to get all 5 right. They're counterintuitive. But the point being that I really wanted people to see, hey, this thing that you think is obvious is actually quite likely to be wrong. And you really don't have a way of knowing that until you run it as an experiment. And that reveals the truth to you. I really wanted to get people to understand that more often than not, their assumptions are flawed. And the more you can pressure test those assumptions as fast as possible, the more likely it is you're going to move the needle. One of these great stories that we have, and one of the moments that was fun was we were having a conversation about how do we keep certain kinds of people who are not creating a group for the right reasons off of the platform. One of the things that Meetup was exceptionally good at was when you'd create a brand new Meetup group, Meetup would on average get you 14 new members in the first 14 days. Is pretty amazing to go from no community to some community. Now, what happens when you're really good at going from no people in something to actually promoting something to a large group of people to get a group going? Well, you can sometimes attract people who are actually not trying to create a community. They're trying to market some product. They're trying to sell essential oils or trying to sell something. And we used to call those predatory business meetups. And we didn't want them on the platform. They were bad news. They created a bad user experience. And we would spend a lot of money actually looking at every single group that came in, reviewing them to make sure that they were a legit group. And if they weren't, we would refund their money and we would send them on their way. So that's a lot of work and a lot of process. And our CEO said, well, what if we included something in our sign up process when you're creating a brand new group? What if we included a checkbox that people had to affirmatively check to say that they promised to create real life community? I pledge to create real life community.
Straight out of the behavioral playbook, right?
Yeah. So Scott Heiferman, our CEO, said this, and we were like, Scott, that's a terrible idea. Our sales are going to fall through the floor. This is terrible. We should definitely not do this because it's going to just add a lot of friction. And he was pretty insistent on it. And then I said, fine, well, we'll do it, but only if we can run it as an experiment so you can see how much money we're going to lose in the process. And so he agreed, and we launched it as an experiment where half of the people going through a sign-up flow had the most streamlined flow possible, and the other half experienced a version that also included this checkbox that you had to check to say that you were going to create real-life community. And we launched it, and we waited a week, and then we waited 2 weeks, and then we looked at the results. And not only did we not lose money, we actually had a 16% increase in people signing up for Meetup groups. And it's one of those moments where like, I cannot believe that adding more friction, which is the opposite of what everyone says you should do, actually netted out more groups, which by the way, was how we also made more money. So it was not only a 16% increase in groups, which translated into activity, it was also a direct improvement and direct benefit on our bottom line, which is great.
And I'm so curious, actually, did the checkbox solve the original concern, which is, did you get less communities set up from these predatory businesses?
It's such a funny question. Nobody's ever asked me that question before. I think it did. Actually, I think it did weed out some, and it certainly made it easier to refund the money. It sped up the process too, because there was an affirmative action that when you refunded people's money, they weren't as upset when you did so too. So it probably did, although that would be really funny if it didn't, if it actually inversely caused, if that 16% was actually people who were predatory business meetups. That would have been funny. I don't think so. I think it did help.
Welcome to the Startup Podcast. We ask the hard questions nobody asks.
I'd actually like to share an experiment that I observed. I can't take credit for it, but I think it just also shows the power of it. And this was about fee increases. In my previous role at Airtasker, we decided we wanted to introduce an admin fee. We're a marketplace, right? We wanted to introduce a fee on the demand side. And we thought we would probably settle for about 2%, a 2% fee. But we decided we wanted to run it as a split test experiment. And we were like, okay, we'll try 1%, 2%, 3%. We think it'll fall somewhere in that range. But let's also try 10% just to sort of see if we can like fit the curve and see how like sensitive these things are to fees. We ran the experiment and it turned out that between 1, 2, 3, and 10%, there was no difference to any of our metrics. And so we were able to actually go ahead with the 10% fee, which brought us probably 12 months closer to cash flow break even. It like massively affected our revenues. And we would never have done that if we hadn't had that experimental mindset and that experimental infrastructure to do it. We just would have picked a fee, seen the numbers stayed stable and like gotten on with our lives and left a lot of money on the table.
One of my absolute favorite things about what you're saying is that there's conventional wisdom, but all that conventional wisdom is just everyone's combined assumptions all put together into one. There's no reason why conventional wisdom is right. It just is because it is. Things are popular because they're popular, not because they necessarily work. And it's so hard to believe until you start running those things. But if somebody would have told you, Yanav, at the very start, hey, charging 5 times as much will have zero impact on your sign-up rates, you would have probably thought they were crazy.
Yeah, we thought it was suicide.
So, Andres, when is the right time to run an experiment then? You could imagine a company at the very, very early stages with a blank piece of paper and no users running an experiment. You could imagine people choosing colors via experiments, as I know Google used to do when Marissa Mayer was running search. And you could imagine people obviously thinking about calls to actions and checkboxes and more substantive features at scale. So like where along these spectrums in terms of scale, in terms of the product market fit journey, in terms of the granularity of these things, when should people be thinking about these experiments?
It's a really great question. It would be tempting for someone like me who's in love with experiments to say, oh, you should experiment all the time. And actually, one of the mistakes I made in my career was almost falling too much in love with it and being a man with a hammer and seeing everything as a nail. Experiments are amazing at driving learning. Experiments are great at driving growth and conversion improvements. However, there's a real material cost that comes from running experiments, and there's real conditions that you need in order for the benefits to outweigh the costs. At its most simple level, when you're in the earliest stages of a startup and you want to run an A/B test on your website, and your website has 8 people visiting a day, it will take you about a year to get enough traffic through that site in order to get statistical significance, in order to be able to know that variant A was in fact better than the variant B. And so in some regards, until you reach a certain volume, it's a complete waste of your time because it would just take you too long to get the answer. So when you're really, really, really small, you just don't have the traffic volume to be able to do it, and there's no sense in trying. The other time when an experiment is not worth doing is when the downside risk is actually quite low. If you are changing your terms of service page, there's really no real reason to run an experiment there because being wrong doesn't really hurt you that much. And being right doesn't really help you that much either. There's not a whole lot of change that's going to happen. And so in some regards, those are both inopportune. To take an extreme example compared to my first one, which is when you're very, very small, it's almost not worth running any experiment at all. As you start to get a little bit of traffic, well, then you can start running some experiments. But in order for there to be a material impact, in order to be able to read and see a change, you kind of need to take bigger swings with your changes in order for you to be able to see it. When you reach the other end of the spectrum, when you're at the Google size, and there's gazillions of page views being shown every single day, a small change in color that represents a 0.0001 improvement in monetization is billions of dollars of revenue. It's a lot of money. And so while Marissa got a lot of flack for testing color, it's actually kind of brilliant to do because that's basically found money. I mean, it is free there. It's not going to be the one thing that sets Google apart in the long term, but it's going to put a lot of fuel in their business that's going to allow them to be more innovative or to take on innovative projects. And so because they have the traffic, they can take smaller and smaller swings as well. The one thing I will say too, which is sort of related to my own personal journey, is I went from just guessing to discovering experiments and being right on the first one and thinking this is the answer to everything. So then I doubled and tripled the size of my team and I doubled and tripled the size of experiments I could run, which was great, but I still wanted to run more. And ultimately, my answer to everything started to become, well, let's run it as an experiment. Do you like this or do you like this? Let's run it as an experiment. Should we do this or that? Let's run it as an experiment. And so as a result, what ended up happening is that our experiments got smaller and smaller, and the impacts got smaller and smaller too. The material changes became less and less. And we started replacing judgment with experimentation. And what experimentation, like all things, is meant to do is inform your judgment and put you in a position where you're going to make better decisions going forward. And so what ends up happening with a lot of people is that they start to run as many experiments as they possibly can because they don't want to be wrong, as opposed to running experiments because they want to figure out what works and to really, really be right. And that's a huge mistake. The other massive mistake that people make, and that I made along the way, is that at a certain point, you also realize, hey, I'm not winning as much as everyone says. I listen to these podcasts and it sounds like everyone runs experiments and they get these massive wins. They just quadrupled the size of their revenue and everyone talks about the checkbox winning and this thing winning or that winning. But what nobody gets up on stage and talks about is that 80% of experiments that people run do not move the needle. Most experiments, at least what we see, experiments take on average about 4 weeks to run to get enough traffic. So on any given page, unless you have the ability to run parallel experiments, you're going to take about 1 month. So you're going to get 12 shots a year. 80% of them are not going to work. So you're going to get 2 to 3 wins over the course of a year. And so what people don't really realize is that even when you are running experiments, you're guessing. You're just guessing in a more informed way. And you get data at the end of it that informs your judgment that makes you better the next guess that you're going to make. So with that in mind, if you understand that there's a real material cost there, you want to use your experiments in a thoughtful way and not just test everything.
I so appreciate your perspective on this because many of the startups and product managers I work with who are very passionate about experiments are in this state. They've abdicated judgment and they don't lift their gaze from the data to look at the horizon and look at the terrain. They have no product market fit, no traffic. In some cases, they have no product or the product is just like fundamentally broken. It doesn't actually take the user on a cognitive journey from A to B to C. They seem to have lost conviction about the future they're trying to build, and they're just being guided down into this incrementalism. And the founder, or most often a product manager who's kind of read all the blogs and read all the books, they're like, okay, great, Chris, that's a great suggestion. We'll run it as an experiment. I'm like, you don't need an effing experiment to tell you that there is no button here that tells the user to go to the next screen. Like, you don't need to run an experiment on that. Now, maybe once you have some users going through the wizard or going through the page, you might want to test where the button goes and what it's labeled, but let's first put a bloody button on the page. And so, in my experience, those who have gotten religion on experiments in early stage startups are often misusing or overusing the tool. I really appreciate that you're talking about the limits of the process and using it judiciously. And in itself is an exercise in taste and judgment, of what to experiment on and how to interpret the data from your experiments.
It's true in startups as it is in mid-market and even larger companies too. It's true all across the board.
Yeah, it nearly feels like the Gartner hype cycle for new technologies, where you have the peak of inflated expectations, trough of disillusionment, and then ultimately to the plateau of productivity. And I feel that every person goes through a personal little hype cycle with experiments where, first of all, they just don't run experiments. They just build stuff and they don't know what works. And then they're like, oh, experiments, these are amazing. We can run them for everything. And you're at the peak of your hype cycle. And then you realize all of their limitations. You get into the trough of disillusionment. And then eventually you're like, oh, experiments are really important, but they have their place. I need to understand where their place is. And that's where you get to that plateau of productivity. And I'm ashamed to say I've probably been through this cycle more than once in my career. I sometimes have to remember where they fit.
It's so true.
And also different stages, right? I went from, you mentioned Google, right? I went from Google, where you could get 10,000 samples in 10 minutes on your experiment, to being at early stage enterprise startups where you'd be lucky to get 100 samples in a month. Everything I thought I knew about experimentation was kind of wrong in that context. And so I had to relearn. And Andres, so far, what we've really been talking about is a specific type of experiment, which is the split test or the A/B test, right? Where we say, okay, we have this version, we have that version, we see which one performs better. But one thing that I think I've learned over the years about experiments is, you mentioned when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Good experimentation is about having a toolkit and then knowing which tool to use. And ultimately, what makes an experiment is, as you've said, learning, right? It's about having a hypothesis and then testing that hypothesis and getting more confidence about whether that hypothesis is true or not. And so I would say, in different contexts at different stages of a startup with different types of hypotheses, different experimentation tools are appropriate. Split testing can feel like the cleanest, easiest, most scientific, but there are quite a number of conditions that need to be true before the split test is the best way to test your hypothesis.
That's right. I mean, what I like to say is that we as product leaders, we as entrepreneurs, are approximating a truth about what is it that people actually want and how do you solve their problems. What's their problem and how do you solve it in ways that they're willing to pay for? And we're just approximating a truth. And conversations with them give you some insights to approximate that truth. And there's a lot of error. Surveys have a lot of error. They approximate the truth. Usability testing gives you some insights and it gives you a lot of error. So does split testing. All of these things that we're working on are really just there. They're instruments that help you triangulate in on the ultimate truth, which is that somebody cares about this in a way that they're willing to pay for, and your solution really hits the nail on the head in terms of creating the magic that they're hoping for. And that's it. That's it. And the beautiful thing about it is, as long as you're not a startup experimenting in the pharmaceutical space or in rockets, more often than not, no one's going to die from you being wrong. And so your ability to be wrong is actually quite good. It's a benefit there, which allows you to triangulate and approximate the truth by doing and observing and doing and observing, as long as you're doing and observing in ways that materially produce insights. My point of view is, whatever the fastest path is to the truth is the right answer. And so, Chris, like your point, if there's a boulder in the road, if there's just no button to advance to the next step on a wizard, hey, that's a problem. That's a boulder in the road. You don't need an experiment to show you that. As you get closer and closer to trying to get to an outcome that you want, there's a truth related to, what does the experience need to feel? How committal do you want your experience to be at this stage? What do you need to present? What's the kind of imagery that works or doesn't work? The needs and the changes unfold, and it gets harder and harder to elicit that in a qualitative manner. And so whatever you can do that will help you hone in on the truth fastest is what you need to do, whether you're Google size or whether you're a day one startup.
We've started to touch on this already, but let's start to unpack what are the common mistakes and misconceptions around experiments, right? And some of the ones we've really already covered are asking the right questions or knowing when to run a good experiment. And that itself takes a bit of judgment and taste and intuition, and you need to make those choices judiciously. I touched on the idea of drawing the right conclusions from data generally and experiments specifically. But I think there's at least three others, and Andres, maybe you have others, but we can talk about downstream and upstream effects, where you may be running an experiment on a button, but actually the real impact is up or downstream. We've talked a little bit about statistical significance, and we've mentioned the phrase causation, but this idea of causation and correlation. So maybe let's unpack some of those, and then if you have any others as well that are common mistakes and misconceptions.
That sounds great. Do you want to kick us off, Chris?
Yeah, so I mean, downstream and upstream effects is related to the first two that I'm always very passionate about, where you have a product manager who's fixated on a button or on a screen. Why isn't it converting, or how do we run an experiment on it? And I'm like, by the time the user gets to this screen, they're thoroughly confused, or they're not set up with the right emotional cognitive journey. The problem is not on the screen. The problem is 3 screens earlier, and the promise or the story that we started to tell back there. That's an example where you can misapply experimentation and be fixated on the wrong problem.
It's a really great point, and it's one that really comes around problem definition as well. And so related hypothesis is your problem definition. Have you defined the problem in the right way? To your point, if your problem is, I want more people to get past step 4, but you haven't considered what 1, 2, and 3 are, then you probably haven't defined the problem in the right way. And so that's probably one of the bigger components. But in terms of upstream, one of the hardest challenges actually is just knowing where to fish. There's the classic RICE methodology that people apply to that: reach, impact, confidence, and effort. I can go into that in great depth and talk about all the places where that's flawed. But that's one approach that I've seen people take in terms of figuring out where to dive in. But the best advice I would give, I think you're absolutely right, is really just around problem definition and trying to understand what you're framing for the upstream effects.
You talked about defining the hypothesis, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the importance of defining the hypothesis, because, this is sort of a question about scientific method and the degree to which we need to be purists about it versus being practitioners. When you're making a split test, you can say, well, I'm not defining a hypothesis. I'm just trying 2 different things. I'm going to see which one works better. Are there risks to not having a clearly articulated hypothesis before you kick off an experiment?
It's a great question. To be really candid and reveal my bias, I come from a family of scientists. I am a behavioral scientist by training, but I tend to be very pragmatic. I don't necessarily believe that you have to have a scientifically structured hypothesis with an if-then statement that frames every single thing you do in terms of running an experiment. It depends on what you're trying to solve. In that regard, I really feel like it comes back to the problem statement and to looking for evidence of a truth. And so, like, when I think about a hypothesis, for example, that I might have at this stage in a journey, somebody needs to have their anxiety relieved. You need to relieve anxiety that people might feel at this stage in a sign-up process. You could run an experiment where you're systematically trying to address it, and you can run that in a lot of different ways, because how you do it might actually increase anxiety. Looking at the observation or looking at the outcome reveals to me the kind of approach that I need to take at the end of the day as a result. And so I tend to be much more casual in the structuring of the hypothesis and taking advantage of the data outcomes to reveal patterns about what is in fact truly happening without trying to confirm my own bias, without trying to prove that I'm right, if that makes sense.
I think you're talking about like how casually or otherwise you define the hypothesis, but I think the tell was you talked about a problem statement. And in this context, the problem statement, well, that is the hypothesis. In my experience, there is risk to just sort of throw spaghetti against the wall style, where you're like, I'm just going to run this experiment and see what the data tells me. If you don't know why you're running it, that can actually cause some perverse outcomes. And I know just enough about statistics to know that statistical significance can be easily abused and misinterpreted. So you need to be careful not just to go on fishing expeditions. The other thing I wanted to mention about downstream and upstream effects is obviously one place where it's very common to run experiments is somewhere along a conversion funnel. And if you're saying, okay, my job is to improve activation, and you run an experiment that indeed does improve activation, but it has an effect downstream, right? It means that your retention gets worse.
Mm-hmm.
You can end up with a situation, if you're not careful, where you have teams that are each optimizing their own bits of the funnel, and they're all running experiments that seem to be positive, but they're actually negatively impacting each other. And so you just sort of get this destructive interference where you're not actually improving the customer experience, you're not actually improving the overall funnel. So how do you, in your experience, make sure that you're running a tight experiment, but you're also thinking about those broader implications?
Sure. So to your example of looking at it as a funnel, for example, one of the important things to do in that case is to have full measurement across the entire funnel to the endpoint of what you want to look at. And I had friends, for example, in the early days of running experiments over at Shutterstock, and they had a dashboard where every experiment they ran, regardless of what it was instrumented to do, looked at every other metric it could possibly affect downstream. So for free, every experiment they ran looked at month 2 retention, month 4 retention, whatever it was, just kept looking at it for free, even if you didn't think to instrument your panel or your experiment to do that. Really brilliant. And if you ever have a chance to hire somebody from Shutterstock from the early 2000s, you should, because the whole crew there is brilliant.
Okay.
And they all went on to do really brilliant things. But it was a really great way of understanding, which is one, just looking at and instrumenting it. 2, you could look at it as a problem or you could look at it as an opportunity. I tend to see it as an opportunity if you're looking at the whole picture, which is that in some regards, I sort of think of it as air in a balloon. Let's say suddenly you figured out a way to triple the traffic to your site, but you haven't tripled the number of signups. But there's now 3 times as many people there that are sort of, there's an opportunity to move them further. And if you squeeze the balloon a little bit further, maybe you've moved more people into stage 1 and into a sign up flow, but they're not all finishing it. But there's an opportunity there to move them through and to keep pushing them through. As long as they're the right kind of customer, as long as you're not completely off base, it does create this opportunity to extract more yield at the end of the day because you just have more air in that balloon. If you can get more of it to flow to the end, then you're good. As long as you don't celebrate like your friends did at Etsy, as long as you're not celebrating the seasonality, as long as you're not celebrating your local victory and understanding that you're looking at the whole problem, that to me creates a huge opportunity. I'm dealing with that right now as I'm optimizing my sales funnel in my current company and just trying not to get discouraged when you see a movement, but it's just creating a new problem. Every solution is really creating like the seeds for tomorrow's problem that you get to solve. But that to me is a sign of success in some ways, more than it is a sign of things going horribly off the rails. The larger problem is you don't see any additional air going in, and then you're just on a fishing expedition, but you're just fishing with no idea where the fish are.
Yeah, I think the clearest example of one of these things where there are these upstream or downstream effects is like if you're in marketing or growth marketing and you're just shoving users into the top of the funnel, but they're the wrong user, and you have all these people downstream in product trying to get these users to convert, and you're like, I don't know what's going on. You're creating problems downstream. You're running these incredible experiments on which ad performs better, but performs better with which cohort, with what intent is the real question.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Until Now. From brand and product design to product management through to go-to-market and product strategy, Until Now lets you augment your existing team with the skills required to achieve the best outcomes for your startup. So check out their work and get in touch at untilnow.com.au.
So let's talk about the next mistake and misconception. We've touched on this a little bit a few times through the episode, but this idea that experiments need to achieve statistical significance. So just very quickly, what that means is if you have 5 people going through your funnel and you run an experiment and 3 go one way and 2 go another, that is not a significant enough a number of people to give you a definitive or scientific answer. What you more likely need is 50 or 500 or 5,000 or 50,000 people to go through that funnel. Andres, how do you think about statistical significance? What is that number and how should you set that number before you feel confident about your experiment?
With statistical significance, going back to the science of it, you're sampling part of the population, looking at their behaviors, and you want to extrapolate to the whole population. And what you're really looking at is when I look at this outcome that I see from a sample, what are the odds that it actually truly reflects the larger population as opposed to it just being this weird outcome that happened on a random chance? So really just question, is your outcome random or is it because of something you did? When people say statistical significance, what they're usually borrowing from is the world of science, and they say 95% statistical significance, which means that there's a 5% chance that it's not necessarily right. And so if you're going to put a pill in somebody's body, you're going to probably go for 3 levels of statistical significance. You're probably going to go to the 99% and making sure you're not killing people. So the first question in general is, how much error are you willing to live with? Do you want to go to the pill state at 99.999? Do you want to go to 95? Maybe you want to go to 80. Now, the disadvantage to going to 80% is now you've got 20% error rate. There's a chance that what you're seeing and what you're calling is right might actually not be truly right. But to run something at a 99 means that your methodology, the sample, the approach, the time it usually takes is like an order of magnitude larger than to go to statistical significance at the 95% level. And then that's considerably larger than going at the 80% level. And so the first thing you want to look at is, how much error am I willing to live with? And one of the things I'll counsel people on is if you're not putting a pill in people's body, you can probably live with more error than you think you can. If it means you can move faster and get results sooner, to learn faster, to figure out what to do. And then you can repeat the trial. You can do things in a lot of different ways similarly to see if you have a consistency. To be extreme, if something takes you a day to figure out as opposed to a month, you now have dramatically increased your speed and your likelihood of being able to find the answer. Now, more often than not, if you're losing, like I said, 80% of the time, you need to figure out how to hone in on what works faster. And you might be willing to live with a little bit more error in order to get more trials in, or in order to get more results sooner, so that you're able to learn more quickly or hone in on the kind of things that are more likely to work. It sounds like sacrilegious. You're talking to a scientist again, who's basically saying, live with more error than you think you need, than you think you can deal with. But there's oftentimes a meaningful trade-off. There's a gain to be had by increasing the amount of error that you have in order to dramatically increase the loops with which you're going to learn.
Without getting too technical in the details, there's a school of statistics called Bayesian probability, where the idea is you incorporate your prior beliefs, your pre-existing beliefs, with the data that you gather. So you say, rather than pretending everything is a blank slate, I have a set of beliefs and I update those beliefs based on the experiment results. And I actually think this is a very powerful way of thinking about things in the context of running experiments, because we've talked about the fact that you need to have taste and conviction and your own experience that's valuable. So not all experiments are created equal, right? Some of them you're fairly confident you know what's right, but you just want to check it. Whereas others you're like, this is a Hail Mary, it probably won't work, but the upside is so big that it's worth trying. And again, you don't have to be technical about it. You can be informal, which is basically to say, the more unlikely the result, the higher the statistical significance should be before I accept it. And that works both ways, right?
Yeah, and you're also saying the more risky the thing you're testing, the less error you're willing to accept.
Exactly right.
More often than not, the amount of risk you can take is probably higher than you think, and the amount of error you can handle is a little bit higher than you think. So don't get too caught up in the level of risk, don't get too caught up in the error margin, and go a little faster than you probably are comfortable going.
That's right. And in that case, the real risk in the system is not doing enough things, right? Is moving too slowly.
Yeah, and this always brings me back to my work with early stage startups, or even startups that are later stage, but their stuff is still broken, where it's like the risk of fixing this funnel just based on intuition is really low. It does not require us to test our way to a new wizard or new funnel. Let's figure out from there, how do we optimize it and make smarter data-driven choices. So the next common mistake and misconception is causation and correlation. I spent a lot of time at Uber, especially with so many variables and so many teams doing so many different things. I spent a lot of time with my data scientists trying to unpick, did what we do have just correlation, or was there actual causation here?
Yeah, I'm sure your data scientists loved having that conversation with you. It seems like data scientists all over the place basically get handed a data set after a change was made and say, hey, can you figure out if we were right or wrong here? Can you figure out if what we did made a difference? Pre-post. So somebody launches something brand new and then they say, we don't have time to figure out, we don't have time to run this as an experiment. So they launch it pre-post and then they basically wait a month and they can't figure out what's going on. So they ask their data scientists, can you try and figure out if what we did made a difference? And data scientists hate that. It's basically, they want to pull their hair out every time I've seen it.
Just to be very clear about pre-post, right? What you're saying is the idea of just shipping it and seeing how the numbers changed after you shipped it, rather
That's
than running it
exactly
as an
right.
experiment where you run some users through one way and other users through the other way.
That's exactly right.
Just to explain that little bit of jargon.
The essence of, though, I think what you're getting at is essentially when you launch something brand new and you don't launch it in a structured way. So you don't run it in a way that there's a systematic control versus a variable. There are a series of events that happen before, there's a series of events that happen afterwards, almost like weather. And so you might launch something and the next day you might notice that it's sunny outside and that your sales went up 20%. And so there's a correlation between your sales and the sunshine, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the sun being out affected your sales by 20%. And so the only real way you're going to know whether it was the sunshine or not is if you varied it across multiple places that are going to have different weather. And therefore you're going to know whether or not it's actually the sunshine that's causing the effect or not. And that's probably the simplest way of sort of explaining the difference between causation and correlation. The unfortunate truth as well is that when people speed up the launch of something and they try to get something out the door faster and they say, well, we'll just figure it out by looking at the data after the fact. More often than not, in my experience, the amount of time it takes to unpack the data and the amount of wrangling you got to do with the data means that you don't usually get insights till much, much later. It takes weeks or months to actually get insights on what the thing you just did was from a correlational point of view. And you're almost better off just launching it as an experiment, because if you're measuring not speed to launch, but speed to result or speed to knowledge, it is often the case that running as an experiment is actually faster than running it as pre-post, if you're going to have to untangle that spaghetti web of just data and mess that you made to try and figure out what actually happened. And I've seen that happen many, many times, to the point where I've seen data scientists be on the verge of quitting.
I also want to unpack what you said there about the time to truth, right? So I would estimate that some 99% of people building products, building tech, their fixation is on time to ship, time to get the thing out the door. That's what the deadlines are all about, the OKRs are all about. It's like, when did we get that new feature out? And what you're talking about is time to truth and time to impact. When did we actually increase the number of users through our funnel, or the number of successful transactions in our marketplace? And if you're measuring that, that's a very, very different set of priorities you have, and a very different set of behaviors that you have. And it goes much broader, this psychosis of like just shipping more and more and more features and feeling like we've done good work here, boys and girls. We can pat ourselves on the back. And this goes all the way to the very beginning of the conversation, right? Which is, you can actually remove features in some cases and it has no impact on the outcome. And you're taking credit for the sun rising in the morning. And so this whole episode really is about understanding that it's not just about shipping more features. It's about understanding a user, understanding their intent, understanding how are you actually solving a problem, and setting up scientific or pseudoscientific experiments to try to validate the work you're doing and get time to truth. Because truth and truth seeking are the surest path to success.
It feels good. It feels good to launch. You get up in front of the company and you get to show off your demo, and everyone applauds and everyone feels good. Slides get put into board decks and that looks good, and the team looks good. And the same is true for shipping experiments. Like, a lot of teams measure themselves based on velocity. A lot of teams say, oh, well, our goal is to launch 5 experiments a month. Well, do those experiments make a difference? That's besides the point. And so velocity feels good, launching feels good, shipping feels good, and it looks good. But at the end of the day, what you really need to start measuring is the ultimate outcome and how quickly you got to the ultimate outcome, because that's our most precious resource, is usually time more than it is money at the end of the day. Where on a cosmic scale, it's certainly time.
I just want to connect this to the difference in mindset in different markets, because, the Startup Podcast is really all about why these intuitive things in most markets are so wrong from the point of view of Silicon Valley, right? And I think a lot of people outside of Silicon Valley, outside of the school of Uber and Amazon and Facebook and Google style product thinking, they come from agency worlds, right? And big co worlds where you get a pat on the head if you hit the deadline for the client. It's all about looking good and shipping glossy things. And the validation comes from media and academia and government. And so these are the incentives. Even if you haven't been in these businesses and situations before, it's in the water. It's around universities. And, did you get your assignment done on time, right? What we're talking about here is that the Silicon Valley way of thinking about product and business is about commercial impact at scale. And it's not about, did you get a headline in the newspaper, or did a government department pat you on the head? It's about, did you scientifically move the needle on the number of people using your product? And that's just such a fundamentally different culture and mindset that you have to break out of to even understand the purpose of experiments in the first place.
And even within Silicon Valley, I think there's different degrees to which people are exhibiting that behavior and learning it and actually behaving in that way. And so I think within Silicon Valley, there's still a lot of people who love to ship and they're not necessarily thinking about it in the right ways. I think there's pockets of people who are thinking about it in more advanced ways, and they're the ones that 2 years from now are going to be the ones that are going to be much, much more successful than the folks who are just really just focused on the simple velocity metrics.
Hey, I love nothing more than shipping. It's tons of fun.
Right.
It's like I'm guilty of this just as much as anybody else. Yanev, you wanted to talk about long-term effects?
I think one thing that I've fallen victim to with experiments is sometimes there are longer term health metrics that can be potentially negatively impacted. Let's say you run an experiment and you overpromise something to your customers. You might improve conversions, but later on, they're going to realize that you are not keeping that promise and they'll churn. Now, obviously, you wouldn't do that deliberately, but you can actually accidentally end up in these situations where you are, in a sense, eating your own future, right? You are improving your metrics today at the expense of your metrics a year from now. You can get this sort of funnel myopia. You're like, I just need to move this metric. I just need to move this metric. And so that's something, again, where I'm not sure there's an easy answer, but it's just something to be mindful of, that underneath all of that, there is a customer and a user who is having an experience with your product, and that needs to be front of mind for you at all times.
It's a great point. I mean, the best way to solve for that is to measure the experiment, to keep monitoring an experiment for extended periods of time. Related to that, the one thing you can do is, you see this all the time. People will launch an experiment. It will look good in the near term, but if you're tracking it and you ultimately see, actually, this created a worse effect. Net growth 4 months from now was down. Net new customers was down because the new people who adopted the product as a result of this change are worse customers and they're much more likely to churn. You see companies revert. So you don't have to wait 4 months to execute the change. You could see there was early results, execute the change. As new data comes in that informs your judgment as to how it actually performed on a longer duration, you are entitled to revert at that point. You can flip the results. You're not locked in or wed to the ultimate outcome from an experiment. As long as you're measuring it in the long term, if that's something that really is important to you, there's no reason why you can't flip it.
Well, hopefully we've thoroughly explained what is an experiment, why you might run one, and some of the things that'll get you heading down the wrong path. Let's talk about tooling. So it sounds pretty hard to run these split tests and measure them and understand the results and stuff. Is there some existing industry standard tools that help engineers implement these things, product managers to design these things and to operate them at small, medium, and large scale?
Yeah, there's never been a better time than now to run experiments. When I started running experiments, we had to build the tooling to run the experiment in-house and then run the experiment. It was such a pain in the neck. The amount of time it took forever. So to run a test used to be ridiculously hard. Now, thanks to tools like Optimizely, Adobe Target, VWO, IntelliMize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there's more tools than ever to be able to launch experiments. So the ability to execute an experiment, to systematically vary an experiment, amplitude, launch darkly, there's more and more. There's dozens and dozens of players out there and more every day that are facilitating and making it easier to launch experiments quickly. So it's never been easier to launch. And that's really great news for the industry. And there's so many options out there. I can't even get into like which one's better. There's different ones that are better for different segments that people talk to. But by and large, if your point of view is that I can't launch experiments because it's too hard to do, it's actually quite simple. It's not trivial, but it's simpler than it's ever been. And it's only going to get easier going forward.
Now, Andres, we wanted to finish by actually asking about your own product, DoWhatWorks. It's such a cool idea. You mentioned that most experiments fail, and of course, it's quite expensive to run experiments. So why not learn from other people's experiments and shortcut your way to some of the learning? So tell us a little bit about DoWhatWorks and also how it actually works under the hood.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I just said, it's never been easier to launch experiments thanks to all those different tools that are out there. It's harder than ever, though, to actually get experiments to win. And so the underlying problem that we're solving is what I realized is that 80% of experiments that people run don't move the needle. And we believe they don't move the needle because everyone who's running a test is running the exact same test in isolation, and no one's able to benefit from the learning. So you only learn from your own test. And what we've built is the ability, is an engine that has a patent on it that allows us to detect the experiments that are being run by any company we care to look at. And so as a result, if you are a streaming company, we work with 6 of the top streaming companies, for example, they want to understand and learn from every one of the experiments that their competitors are running. But they also want to learn from the experiments that are happening in the news sector. And so they follow experiments from the New York Times, for example, right? They want to learn, how are people pitching subscriptions in the New York Times? How are people pitching subscriptions for learning products, et cetera, et cetera. So the engine in and of itself and what our service allows our customers to be able to do is to be able to see the experiments that are run by others, see the individual specific tests by page, by specific component, and then understand what wins and loses based on our algorithms and based on how we're delivering the insights to people. And so what that means for us is that we've now gone from having this little toy that we started playing with 4 years ago to something that is a real engine that's humming at full speed right now, that's produced over 18,000 experiments. And so you sort of think about, like, it takes 1 month to run an experiment. That's like 700 years. It would take 700 years to recreate that number of experiments if you were to run them on your own. And our point of view is that you don't need to run all those experiments yourself. If the goal is speed to learning or speed to win, if you can take half of those things you were thinking about trying and seeing what other people have done and seeing if other people have tried that specific thing, seeing how that worked out, and weeding out the experiments that are not worth pursuing and honing in on the ones that are more likely to work by virtue of what's winning across the board for other people, then you're much more likely to beat that 20% win rate. And if you can make the 20% go to 40% or 60%, you've now doubled or tripled your win rate over the course of a year, which has a profound impact on your bottom line metrics as well. So the essence of what we do is really just are able to see everyone's experiments, harness them, and let our customers take advantage of them in ways that make a huge difference for them.
This is just so awesome. I think there is a whole class of tool across multiple facets of life, but startups specifically, where I think we could be crowdsourcing intelligence, even candidate intelligence around interviewing people and so on, and other facets as well. And I think you're so right that these experiments are so necessary, but are costly. And there are best practices, there are learnings that are in the wild. And being able to collect, navigate, and learn from those is such an incredibly powerful idea. And so I'm so glad that you built this. I'm going to sign up right now. I think it's really cool. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about the space in general and for building this tool specifically. It's been really helpful, and I think the audience will have gotten a hell of a lot from this, Andres.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. A real fun conversation. I loved your points of view and your provocative questions.
Fantastic. And Andres, just for other folks who might be interested in checking out DoWhatWorks, it's DoWhatWorks.io. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
And if folks want to find you on social media, where can they find your stuff?
I tend to spend time on LinkedIn. That's my community of choice. So they can find me by doing a search Andres Glusman at LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, like Chris said, thanks so much for coming on, Andres. Chris, I think Andres has given people a real masterclass in how to run experiments, but sometimes founders need that little bit of extra help turning these learnings into actual action. So if they want to get help from you, how do they reach out?
Yeah, that's right. And if they can check out chrissard.com/advisory. I spend a lot of time helping founders and product managers think through these topics one-on-one. So learn more there and reach out if I can be helpful.
Fantastic.
And of course, don't forget, if you've listened to a few of our episodes and felt like you've gotten value, you've implicitly signed up to the Startup Podcast Pact, which says you promise to help promote the show and help us help more founders by subscribing to us and rating us on your favorite podcasting app and sharing the news about the show on your favorite social network. So please do that. Every little bit helps a huge amount. You know, Jan, you and I keep looking at the stats to keep ourselves motivated, and it's going up and to the right. It's very exciting. So thank you to everyone who's done that already.
And Andres Glusman, thanks once more. DoWhatWorks.io, folks. Check it out.
Have a good night.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by the team at Until Now. Until Now's experts work alongside you and your team, which means that they level you up as they go. I've worked with these folks at Airtasker, and they're behind the recent fantastic rebrand of this very podcast. They are the real deal. Check out their work and get in touch at untilnow.com.au. That's untilnow.com.au. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Insil. Most paid marketing campaigns have a negative ROI. Don't let that be you. Insil brings big brand expertise to small businesses across Australia and pride themselves on their no BS approach to driving traffic, leads, and sales for your business. They're award-winning, but more impressive in my view is the 4.8-star rating that they've earned on Google. Read the reviews, then jump onto insil.com.au and ask them how they can help you. Tell them we sent you.